Good evening. If you have a Bible with you, I recommend you turn over to Ezekiel chapter 18. That's where we're going to be spending just about all of the sermon in Ezekiel chapter 18. We live in an age and a time where people don't really like to take accountability or responsibility for their actions. But I don't think that's something unique to this age. I think that's a common habit of humanity. It's one that we tend to pick up on at an early age. If you grew up with siblings, you probably understand that. When I would get caught doing something I wasn't supposed to at a young age, I would point to my older brother. He told me to do it. It was his fault, his crime that he committed. It's something that we've seen humanity do since the beginning of creation. When God confronts Adam and Eve in the garden, confronting them about their sin, how did they respond? Adam said, "It was the woman you gave me. She gave me the fruit and I ate." And the woman said, "It was the snake. He deceived me. He was the one who caused me to sin." They were shifting the blame, not willing to take responsibility and accountability for their actions. So people don't like the consequences that come with falling short of the mark. And that's exactly the kind of mindset we see in these exiles in the book of Ezekiel. They're suffering the consequences of sin. They are out of their homeland and they're saying, "Woe is me. I don't deserve this. I'm innocent. This isn't my fault." And Ezekiel is having to deal with that issue in chapter 18. And the sermon title tonight is Individual Accountability, because that's what we need to have if we truly want to approach God and have a relationship with Him. We need to have the humility to accept when we're wrong, to see our shortcomings, and accept God's grace and move forward. Ezekiel is having to wake up the exiles to that message, and we're going to look at how he makes his argument and the points he's having to make to these people. And the first point he's having to make to them is, you cannot blame your ancestors for this. Now let's go back and read those first four verses of Ezekiel 18 that Mike read for us a moment ago. Ezekiel 18, 1 through 4. The word of the Lord came to me. What do you mean by using this proverb concerning the land of Israel? The fathers eat sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. As I live, this is the declaration of the Lord God, you will no longer use this proverb in Israel. Look, every life belongs to me. The life of the Father is like the life of the Son. Both belong to me. The person who sins is the one who will die. There's this repeated proverb, this saying. It's mentioned here in Ezekiel among the exiles. It's also mentioned in Jeremiah to those who are in Jerusalem facing the siege from Babylon there, saying, the fathers eat sour grapes, but the children are the ones who suffer the consequences. It's an observation on their situation and their view on it. If you've ever eaten, a lemon, just taking a bite out of lemon, I've had to do that for helping recovery from oral surgery or infection. You take a bite of that, what happens? The juice floods your mouth and your muscles in your cheeks clench, your teeth start to grind. There's consequences to your actions. Well, their view is the fathers are the ones eating these sour fruit, but nothing happens to them. They got off free. They didn't have any of those consequences, but the children are the ones who are tasting this sourness. They're shifting the blame. They're sitting there suffering from their consequences in exile. They understand it's a consequence of sin, but they're claiming that it's not their sin, it's a consequence of. But rather, those of their ancestors, their fathers, they are the one to blame for this, and we are innocent. As one commentator put it, they are giving into a cosmic fatalism, saying, "Woe is me, this is my fate. This was written in stone before I was born, and it's a fate I have to bear with, and there's nothing I can do about it." It's the mindset of the people, and they're never going to move forward until that mindset is broken. So God says, I don't want this proverb taught anymore. I don't want this spoken anymore. It's not beneficial to your condition. You're never going to grow until you accept responsibility. The question is this a fair assessment of their situation? Are they right in saying this proverb? The answer is no. But we have to talk about what kind of consequence is the exile. Because when you just observe the world, you realize that there are extending consequences of sin to other people. There are social and moral consequences that do befall the children from the parents at some times. You see that with David's affair with Bathsheba. There were extending consequences to David's whole family. But this isn't a consequence of social or moral value, but this is a completely different type of consequence. It is a legal consequence. The exile was a legal punishment for transgressing the law. In Deuteronomy chapter 28 and in verse 36, it is listing out these curses, these consequences if you break this covenant. And among those curses in verse 36, you have, if you sin, you and the king you put over you will be taken into a land you will not know. You will be taken into exile. It was a legal consequence in a court setting. And in their own law, the law God gave them in Deuteronomy chapter 24, I'm going to go and read a verse from there. We see how legal consequences are handled when it comes to fathers and their children. Who is to blame for this? Who receives justice? In Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 16, it says this: Fathers are not to be put to death for their children, and children are not to be put to death for their fathers. Each person will be put to death for his own sin. We see right here the same point Ezekiel is making. It's in their law. This is how they were supposed to handle justice. This is how God views justice. The sons are not to blame for their father's sin. They don't receive the punishment for their father's sin, nor the fathers for their sons, but God judges each person by their individual actions. Sometime along the way, they forgot that, or they abandoned that idea, and this proverb took its place. But Ezekiel is reaffirming a truth they should have known, that they are the ones responsible for this. So you have no right in speaking this parable. And yet, in some ways, this parable still prevails today. You have the famous doctrine, false doctrine of what we might call original sin or inherited sin in very popular circles in Catholicism, Lutheranism, Calvinism, places like that, popularized by Augustine, who wrote and taught in the late 4th, early 5th century AD. And it's the view that you are born into a state of sin. You are born guilty just because your parents were guilty and were sinful. You are born guilty not based off of anything you did or a sin you committed. It is just your fate. It is something you can't control. It's a removal of personal accountability, of individual responsibility. It is the same thing we see here. Blaming someone else for your outcome. Is that a fair way to judge a situation? Hypothetically, let's just say very much hypothetically, you had a parent who committed some great crime, but they were never caught. And they passed away before any justice was brought about. But one day, a cold case detective comes knocking on your door and says, "You're coming with me." You didn't do anything wrong. You're being taken away because of a crime your parent committed. Is that fair? Is that just? Well, we would say no. We wouldn't judge cases like that, and that's not how God judges. You can't blame your ancestors. And the central point of this text that Ezekiel is trying to make to them is you can blame yourselves. You are the ones to be accountable for your own actions. This consequence is because of your deeds. You can't claim innocence in this matter. And he's going to set up this argument by looking at this case study, a hypothetical of 3 generations, of a father who is righteous, a son who is not so righteous, and a son not like the one before him. And we're going to see how God judges each and every case of these men. Let's continue reading in Ezekiel, beginning in verse 5. Suppose a man is righteous and does what is just and right. He does not eat on the mountain shrines or look to the idols of the house of Israel. He does not defile his neighbor's wife or approach a woman during her menstrual impurity. He doesn't oppress anyone, but returns his collateral to the debtor. He does not commit robbery, but gives his bread to the hungry and covers the naked with clothing. He doesn't lend at interest or for profit, but keeps his hand from injustice and carries out true justice between men. He follows my statutes and keeps my ordinances, acting faithfully. Such a person is righteous. He will certainly live. This is the Lord's declaration. You have this first man, the beginning of this family, and he's righteous. He follows the law to a T. He doesn't do anything wrong. He doesn't commit sin. And not only does he not commit sin, but he does good. He gives to the poor. He gives to the needy. He does not hold interest over others. He shows care and compassion to people. God says, this is the one who will live. But as you read on, his son is not like him. He bears the son, raises the son, and he does everything opposite of his father. You see that everything the father didn't do, the son did, committed every sin he could. And what is his outcome? In verse 13, near the end of this, he will not live since he has committed all these detestable acts. He will certainly die. His death will be his own fault. And then finally, you have this last son, the son of the wicked man. Now, suppose he has a son who sees all the sin of his fathers has committed, and though he sees them, he does not do likewise. He does not eat at the mountain shrines or look at the idols of the house of Israel. He does not defile his neighbor's wife. He does not oppress anyone, hold collateral, or commit robbery. He gives his bread to the hungry and covers the naked with clothing. He keeps his hands from harming the poor, not taking interest or profit on a loan. He practices my ordinances and follows my statutes. Such a person will not die for his father's iniquity. He will certainly live. His son turns his ways around. He does not follow his father, but he does good. This one will live. How does God judge every one of these cases? He doesn't look at your father or your son, but he looks at you individually, sees how you conducted your life, how you lived, and he judges you based on that. And there's three important points I want us to take from this section, from this case study. Number one, the father does not bear the guilt of the wicked son. Here's a man who lived a blameless life, who did everything right, tried to follow God with everything he had. And you could see a man like this would also follow the commandment to teach your children the law, raise them up to follow God. Here's a man who probably poured everything into raising his son to do the right thing. But that son, as he's an adult, still turns around and lives wickedly, forgetting his father's teaching. Is the father to blame for that outcome? Some people might think so. I've heard cases where this exact outcome happens. You have faithful parents who do everything to raise their children in the right way, but children grow up. They go off on their own and they make their own choices, and some children fall away once they leave the house. I've seen Christians turn on each other, blaming the parents, thinking, this is your fault somehow, that you didn't do what you were supposed to. You should have done better. Maybe you're not as good as we thought you were. God is saying they're not guilty for that. That son, that wicked son, had just as much a choice to follow God as the parents. And so the son is judged based on his choice, and the parents are judged on how they conducted themselves. The second point we see is that the wicked son doesn't get to inherit his father's righteousness. Here's a son who comes from a good family, a family who worships God, serves God, cares about their community, takes care of them, but he doesn't follow in their footsteps. Is he to still be seen as righteous because of his legacy of his parents? Because he comes from a good family? Is that good enough? No. God doesn't look at his parents when judging the son. He looks at the son and the son alone, on his personal commitment, on his personal conviction. There are some people who will come to church not as Christians, not with any personal commitment, but they come because their family comes. Maybe it's a spouse or a child who comes, and they never have any personal care commitment, but they come because they like being there, they like being with their family, and they see their commitment of their family members and how righteous they're living, and they think that's good enough for me then. They're righteous by association, that's good enough. Well, no. Can't be righteous by association. You can't ride into heaven on the coattails of other people's faith. God looks at your personal conviction, your personal relationship with Him, and sees how you live your life. And then the final big point, the point that's to answer this doubt and the question of the people, the last point to take away from this section is the righteous son does not inherit or bear the guilt of his wicked father. This last son, this third son, does not follow in his father's wicked footsteps. He sees that the father was wrong in his ways. He sees that it was a life of sin that would lead to death, and he chooses to live a different way, walk a different path. He follows in the ways of his grandfather instead and does right and does not sin and serves the Lord with his whole life. Does he deserve the guilt of his father? Is he guilty by association here? No, God says he will not die. That's not just. That's not right. He did good, and therefore he should live, just like his grandfather did good, and he should live. That's how God judges people, and that's how we should judge people. Have you ever looked at someone and you know their family history? You know what kind of parents they had. You know that their parents weren't the best people, but they did terrible things to others. And do you ever put that judgment onto their children then, saying, I know who raised you. I know what kind of family you come from. And not even knowing the person, you already assume that they're guilty of the sins of their parents. That's not a just way to look at people. And that's not how God looks at people. In each and every case, he solely looks at the individual. He solely looks at whether they've done good or whether they've done wrong and judges them based on that. That is God's justice. And therefore, the conclusion that we must come to when looking at these words and all the evidence that is presented is there's no one else we can blame besides ourselves. Whether we've done right or whether we've done wrong, the outcome, the consequence is based on how we choose to conduct our life. But Ezekiel's argument doesn't stop there. But the last point he has to make to the stubborn people who refuse to listen, refuse to take accountability, is you can't blame God for this. Let's continue reading on. Dropping down in verse 21 now. But if the wicked person turns from all his sins he has committed, keeps all my statutes, and does what is just and right, he will certainly live. He will not die. None of the transgressions he has committed will be held against him. He will live because of his righteousness he has practiced. Do I take any pleasure in the death of the wicked? This is the declaration of the Lord God. Instead, don't I take pleasure when he turns from his ways and lives? But when a righteous person turns from his righteousness and acts unjustly, committing the same detestable acts that the wicked do, will he live? None of the righteous acts he did will be remembered. He will die because of the treachery he has engaged in the sin he has committed. When Ezekiel presents this case study, he's asking these men of Israel, these exiles, to look at these three men and see which category do you fall under. And as you see in the mindsets that we read in the beginning, when the people probably heard this, they would say, we're that third son. We're the ones who did differently from our fathers, who were actually good and righteous. But if you actually look at the actions Ezekiel lists out in the righteous one and actually judge yourself against this standard, can we truly say they were innocent? The righteous one didn't oppress anyone or hold collateral or did robbery. He never harmed the poor or took interest. He never committed any act of uncleanness. He never forsook the law. Can they really say that they never sinned and were perfect in following the law? Well, if you've read the Bible at all, if you've ever read the Old Testament, you know that's not true. And if you act against the law, even just once, that's enough to enact this punishment. So in no way can they say they were innocent, but they are fully deserving of this. But God says your hope doesn't end there. That doesn't mean I'm done with you. That doesn't mean I'm throwing you out and getting rid of you. But God says here that if you turn around your life, if you repent, if you acknowledge that you're wrong and seek me, I will forgive you. It is a blessed thing that God doesn't judge who we were, but he judges who we are now. You could come from the worst background, the most wicked background, but if you turn around, God forgives that. He overlooks that, and he judges you for who you are today, whether or not you follow him today. The same is true on the opposite, as we see here. That if you live a perfect, righteous life, but then one day decide to just abandon that, you're going to be judged not on what you did before, on all the good you did before, but how you end. That first part is incredibly hopeful for people who desperately needed to hear it, but when they hear those words, that's not their reaction. Instead of taking joy that there is still hope for their situation, they react like this. Let's continue reading here in verse 25. Yet you say, the Lord's way isn't fair. Now listen, house of Israel, is it my way that is unfair? Instead, isn't it your ways that are unfair? When a righteous person turns from his righteousness and acts unjustly, he will die for this. He will die because of his injustice he has committed. But if a wicked person turns from his wickedness he has committed and does what is just and right, he will preserve his life. He will certainly live because he thought it over and turned from all the transgressions he had committed. He will not die. But the house of Israel says, the Lord's way isn't fair. Is it my ways that are unfair, house of Israel? Instead, isn't it your ways that are unfair? They hear this great message about God's grace and mercy, a way to completely turn around their situation, God's forgiveness of even the most wicked individuals, and they say, that's not fair. That doesn't seem like justice to them. Why would God forgive those who were wicked? They didn't see themselves as the wicked. They thought they followed the law and that they could earn their way into heaven, earn their way into salvation. But as Paul argues in the book of Romans, he spends most of the gospel arguing that you can't justify yourself before God by works of the law. No, just one transgression is enough to incur death, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And again, he says, for the wages of sin is death. So if we can't justify ourselves by our works or by our deeds, we need the grace of God. So yes, in a way, it is unfair in a sense. For if God were truly fair with the exiles, they would have been in exile long ago. Because this isn't the first generation that rebelled against God, but as Ezekiel will argue later in the book, the house of Israel was rebellious since they were brought out of the land of Egypt, generation after generation sinning. But God had constant grace and mercy, love and care with them, constantly reaching out, calling them back because he wants them to live. And as Warren Wiersbe writes, if God were fair, he would consign the whole world to hell. Just one sin justifies our condemnation. Yet we're still here. Yet we're still able to stand justified before God. We're still able to worship him and have a relationship with him. Not by anything we've done. We did not earn it, but because of God's grace and love. That's what the Apostle John brings out in his gospel in chapter 3. Famous section, John 3:16, we all know, for God so loved the world that he sent his only son to die. As you continue reading on, you see, for he was not sent into the world to condemn the world, because the world was already condemned. Because we have all sinned and transgressed the law, we are all worthy of this punishment. But he came rather to save the world than condemn it. He came to offer grace and mercy if we seek it and desire it. It's not what we deserve, but God gives it because of his great love for us. As one music artist that I listen to puts it, the beauty of life, or the beauty of grace, makes life unfair. We're able to have confidence, hope, and peace because of what God has done for us. So, by no ways can we look at our situation, look at the consequences of our own actions, and somehow blame God and claim that God is unfair or cruel in dealing with us. No, God has had abundant mercy and patience as we live our lives. If there's anything you should be thankful for this week, is that grace of God. And so, just as the exiles are called to do, we all need to look at our own situation. Who do you blame for your shortcomings? Out in the world, you see people blame just about anything but themselves. We don't like to take the fault. We aren't the ones to blame, but it's always someone else's fault or something else's fault, whether directly or indirectly. People like to blame their genetics and say, "This is how I was born. I can't help myself. There's nothing I could do about it." They like to blame their upbringing. "This is how my parents raised me. This is how they lived. So I'm just going to follow after their ways." People blame their environment, their friends, their coworkers, the government, social media, you name it. There's always someone else to blame for their actions. But those kinds of excuses are not going to work for God. You're not going to be able to stand before the throne and try to blame someone else for your lifestyle. No, God's going to look at you and judge you and hold you accountable. So it's a good time to start looking at yourself now. We need to humble ourselves and not live in pride. Humble ourselves and be willing to accept when we're wrong. And once we're able to humble ourselves, we can approach God and seek His mercy and follow after Him. There is no cure until we accept that we have an illness. So if you're sitting here this evening, you've really reflected on your own life and you're willing to take accountability for your shortcomings and come to God who desires you to live, who wants to give you grace and obey Him, I beg you to not put it off. Or if there's anything we can pray for you about, anything we can help you with, we care about you and we love you. And we want the best for you. If there's anything we can help you with, please come forward now as we stand and sing this invitation song.